tall, I keep my head up, try to be very articulate and polite. And so, of course, I was like, okay, I'm going to be fine because I act this way. And of course, that has nothing to do with it. People, the way people perceive you, and not up to you. My parents taught me, cops are your friends as opposed to,
Hello.
Hello. Okay. Hello, how are you all?
Hey,
We're doing great. How about you guys?
Great. Glad to see Lowry's on here. Thank you for joining us.
We're going to be here. Sun's in your eyes. You want to come over?
No, it's fine.
You sure?
We just want to see Paul's ear. There he is.
I'm here. Sun's in my eyes. I hid.
Move over.
Do we have audio here?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. I've had some issues with that. Most people don't mind not being able to hear me.
I'm glad we can hear your voice.
Yeah.
Okay. We may have people join us late, but I have that it is 6:30 now. So in order to be respectful of your time, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm glad to see the Lowrys here. Do you all want to introduce yourselves? These are good people I met when I was visiting at Madisonville Presbyterian quite a bit before they hired their pastor. So I got to spend quite a lot of time down there. And do you all want to introduce yourselves to the group?
Sure. I'm Steve. I'm an elder at the Madisonville Presbyterian Church, and we really, of course, met Katina the first time in Madisonville while she was serving pulpit supply, and we really, I think, missed a real chance of. I think you had not yet been ordained at that point. I can't quite remember.
I was almost finished with seminary, but not quite.
Yeah, and so you couldn't be on our prospective pastoral list. So Powell won that.
Yay!
And I'm his wife, Debbie Lowry. Nice to meet you all.
We're glad you all are here. Powell people, do you want to introduce yourselves as well? Pat, I have you on the top. You want to start and say your name and.
Hi, I'm Pat Shireman. Good to meet you.
And I'm Jonathan Shireman. I'm an elder in the Presbyterian Church at Powell. And Katina did pulpit supply for us for a while too. That's how we knew her.
And we're the Fishers, Paul and Marcia. And you may know my cousin Eugene Mowdy.
Oh yeah, yeah, yep.
So
Yeah, sure do. Nice to meet you.
good to meet you all.
All right, well, we're glad that you all are here. Just to remind you, this is being recorded and it will be posted later on the church website and on Facebook for people who are not able to join us to watch. But if there's anything later on that you want edited out, if there's anything that you ask a question or make a comment that later on you wish was not in the social media world, that can be done. Just let me know that pretty quickly because I try to get them up this evening or tomorrow. But with that said, although it is not a confidential space, it is a safe space. And so whatever we say here, we will do our best to speak to each other in love, even when we disagree. And that it's important actually that we disagree on certain things because then we can see multiple perspectives, but hopefully to speak to each other in love. And the sort of founding principle of this group is this particular study is anti-racism. So we're starting from the idea that all of us agree that out of love for Jesus Christ and all of God's good creation, that racism is abhorrent and that it is our job to find ways to dismantle the systems of racism that exist. So that's our common theme, and that much is we won't debate in here because that's what brings us together. That whether or not it's important is a debate for outside of this group. And so that's our foundation. Any questions on any of that before we hop in? All right, today's this particular lesson, we're using the bones anyway of the Thoughtful Christians study on racism, and so this one is called Racism 101, and there's quite a lot of definitions and so forth to get through. So we'll try to make it as enjoyable as we can, but I'm going to do some screen sharing. Oh, you want to say? I'm going to do some screen sharing with you because that's the easiest way I know to share information with everyone. If it'll start. Now, once we're in this screen share, if you're not familiar with Zoom, the little box that has everybody's faces on it, you can drag and drop that wherever you want it to get it out of the way. So you can put it at the top or the bottom or whatever, so that you can still see each other's faces, but see the big screen. Okay, so last week we talked about the definition of racism that we were going to work with, and this is the definition the Thoughtful Christian gave us, so we can start here. Racism is a system of advantage and disadvantage based on race. This is a structural system. For racism to happen, a group must suffer systemic disadvantage. So from this, we decided last week that if using this definition, there is no such thing as reverse racism. It would be impossible for racism to exist against anyone of the white race, simply because there is no systemic disadvantage to being white. That there is the advantage and disadvantage system is what separates whites from minorities, that we don't have that disadvantage. So racism would be exclusively for minorities. However, prejudice was the other one we looked at last week. Prejudice includes stereotypes and negative assumptions that any of us might hold, that should be about, another racial group based on incomplete or false information. Prejudice is interpersonal, and a person of any racial group might hold prejudice against another group. So these two things are not necessarily synonyms, we decided last week, because a prejudice is any kind of preconceived idea about any group. And we said, for instance, if you said, I dislike people who drive blue cars, that would be a prejudice, not a racism, because not a part of racism, because there is no systemic disadvantage to driving a blue car. But you certainly could have a prejudice towards them. So we'll stop there. We'll stop right there for right now. And since you've had a week to chew on that, have you picked up on have you seen any examples of prejudice or racism in the community, in the video that we watched this week, or in any of the activities from the 28-day challenge? Has that sparked any recognition of racism or prejudice?
Well, since we don't go out, but, the video actually was quite illustrative of that from the perspective of people who are discriminated against. So I thought that was very interesting to hear that in their own words. Now, we have agreed on the fact that reverse racism is impossible for the white race, but it's talked about and claimed to be a thing by a lot of people, and I've actually heard it in the news quite a bit this week and last week. So how do we understand that? We understand it in this way, but there seems to be a use of the term to advantage by a lot of people. What do we do about that?
Ideas from the group? What do we do about that? When you hear someone use the word reverse racism, or if they say that's racist towards whites, how might we, who have spent the time studying this and are looking into it, how might we respond?
For me, at least, I think I am more prone to respond negatively to that, but it also very much depends on whether I overhear it from someone that I do not know. I absolutely do not tolerate it or that kind of thing with acquaintances and people that I know and have kind of spent time with. And there is a certain danger to applying that to the general public. And as I say that, and as I think that, I cannot imagine being Black and not feeling safe in so many situations and so many environments. It's not the same, but confronting someone we do not know is maybe more dangerous than confronting people we do know, but it's no less difficult, I think. If that makes any sense.
And I'm kind of curious, what do you consider reverse racism? I mean, how does that present itself?
It's ignorance.
Okay.
Well, it presents itself a lot in a working environment. I've heard it said in the retail environment that person just got the job because it's reverse racism, that type of thing. That's what I'm hearing the most.
Oh, that's what you see it as. Okay.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot in the business world. If some young white guy gets a promotion, then he earned it. And if some young African American guy gets a promotion, well, it's filling the quota, or there are 100 different ways somebody can say it, but what they're saying is they got it because they're Black.
Yeah, they want to qualify because of their race. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good example. Yeah, that's a good example.
And I think sometimes it's just, if people, it's so difficult to look at ourselves in the mirror and go, I really failed at that. I wasn't good enough to get that position or good enough to do well on this project. And human beings are so prone to trying to find a scapegoat, find someone else that we can blame for our failures. And it's sort of ramped up so much when you have cultural or racial differences. And inside ourselves, we just have to figure out how to recognize that and just stop.
Jonathan, I think your question as to what do we do when we're confronted with, statements that we're learning to be false. I think that's a really good question, and maybe one that we can chew on together, because if there was any one right answer, then we would just do it and solve racism, right? But obviously there isn't. And so if you're doing the 28-day challenge, there was a really lengthy article I shared with you. I think it was yesterday. And it takes some time to dig through it, but it does specifically go through some different scenarios as far as if you're faced with this situation, here are some possibilities. And there are times when the best you can do is walk away. But then there are also times when silence is consent. And so that, if we don't speak up, then we are condoning what we hear. So it's a balancing act to try to figure out, when do we speak up? When do we walk away? And certainly you're not going to win an argument on Facebook, but there are times to speak. But that's a good question. And I want us to continue to come back to that periodically as we talk about different scenarios. Would this be one where we would speak up, or is this one where we would perhaps recognize that this one's a no-win situation? I think that's a good thing. Okay, so as we start talking about racism, there are different types of racism, many, many, many types. We're only going to look specifically at two today, but of course there are many other things that you could put into this umbrella of racism. But today we're going to look at overt and covert racism. And you may have heard those words, overt and covert, but maybe not necessarily with racism. Let's see. There we go. Overt versus covert racism. Overt racism is the most widely understood form of racism. This one is intentional, things that are undeniably racist. These are things that are direct, and the motivations are normally surface level. So when I think about overt racism, the most obvious example I can think of is the KKK, burning crosses in front yards of peoples of color. That is overt racism. Nobody really denies that is racist. Nobody's trying to hide it. Nobody's trying to disguise it or put a bow on it. It is just racism. And those are easier to identify, I think, than covert racism. Covert racism is a form of racial discrimination that is disguised and subtle. Concealed in the fabric of society, covert racism discriminates against individuals through seemingly passive methods. Covert, racially biased decisions are often hidden or rationalized with an explanation that society is willing to accept. Do those two differences make sense to you?
Yep.
Okay. So then my question to you is, can you think of examples of overt and, there you go, John. Can you think of examples of overt and covert racism? I gave you my example of the KKK is a really easy example of overt.
Well, I guess the covert would be like in the video when that one man was talking, said they seized the women, and they when they walk down the street, if they clutch their purses. Would that like the example of that maybe?
Right. Yeah. In the video we watched, the young man said that as he walks down the street, he notices women clutching their purse, and he says he starts to count it sometimes to see how many times it'll
Right.
happen as he walks. I think that would be covert. It's not quite as, if you ask those people, are you racist? They would probably say no. And yet that is a reaction that they have. Good. Others?
I think
Or are they? I'm thinking overt racism or covert would be more like the zoning laws.
Zoning law.
Penal system.
Right. Redlining, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That red line would go before zoning laws. That would be an older system.
Are you considering that overt, Paul? An overt act?
I'd say a covert. I mean, it's baked in the legal system or into the, I don't know. Yeah, it's baked into the legal system.
You think it's intentional, though? It seems
No,
intentional.
I think it's intentional. Intentionally.
Okay.
Wait, does that get over covert? I don't know.
Well, to me, when someone uses the word covert, I immediately think of hidden and secretive acts. And so, like the example that Pat used of the woman clutching her purse, as described in the video, I'm not sure that would be covert. It may be subconscious. But it's still a obvious thing that someone's doing.
Well, I see that more as an act of prejudice, not as an act of racism, because it's not systematic, societal thing. It's a personal matter.
Right.
I think the biggest thing we see today is with covert is all lives matter. I think when we refuse to, when Black Lives Matter offends us so much so that we have to say all lives matter, we're really missing the point that something is going on to our African American brothers and sisters, and it needs to be addressed. So I think people that say all lives matter, they don't intentionally mean it as racist. They have to take away from another group. And it kind of goes back to what someone was just saying about people look for reasons they didn't get the job. It was because he was Black. You have to make yourself feel good. All lives matter. Well, of course they do. But right now, the ones that need focus are Black lives.
Right. I think Katina said something like that in a sermon. It's all lives will matter when Black lives do matter, right?
The example
white
that
lives aren't on the line right now. I'm sorry, Marcia.
That's okay. The example that we heard about where they submitted applications for jobs and same qualifications, but the Black sounding names or Latino sounding names did not get a call back. They would, now that's covert, I guess,
Where do what we hear people call dog whistles fit into this? That's like secret language that the elect understand to be racist, but hopefully most people won't pick up on it, right?
Yeah, and that's what I think of as covert. It's not that it's not intentional. It's just that we're sort of trying to sneak it under the door intentionally.
Right.
Well, like when you talk about covert missions, they're on a mission. They just don't really want to be seen or found out. So
exactly,
their intent could, or it could be there. It could not be, but most likely it is there. It's just not out in the open.
Well, I have one that this actually happened recently at work, where a team member came to us and said they pointed out a license plate on the front of another's car. It was a Confederate flag pledge, and it had heritage, not hate on it. So he came and we did ask the person if he would remove it, and he said that is having to do with farming, is what he said. So I don't know if that's covert or overt or somewhere in the middle, but it was very odd the way it was tried to rationalize that one.
Well, that fits right in with the definition that we read for sure.
Yeah.
I think you see it especially in the housing market. When we bought our first house in Delaware, the realtor told us about 2 families on the street. It was a cul-de-sac with about 10 houses. And we were told about the black family and the pastor. So I don't know what that says about pastors.
We
But they
think
were
at gardening.
there was a black family across the street.
Sounds like a new TV show.
It's, as you can see, it's not always really easy to determine which one is at play, but keep your eyes open as you are maneuvering the world right now, or Netflix if you're not going out, and for these overt and covert areas of racism. And it may not fit cleanly into one or the other, and it may be that for one person it may be a very overt act, and for another a very covert act. But let's keep looking for those, and now that we have the vocabulary to call it what it is, we can start using those terms. One example of covert racism. Now remember, covert is not synonymous with unintentional. It may be intentional or it may be unintentional. Those two things are not synonymous with covert. But one example of covert racism with being, appropriate in society is something called microaggressions. Microaggressions, this is a term that was coined decades ago, and a microaggression is essentially an innocent statement which jabs at a race. I saw a video the other day that says it's like picking at a scab. The first time someone picks at it, it's not a big deal, but if you just keep picking at it, eventually it bleeds. And that's the idea of a microaggression. Is it may be intentional or it may be unintentional, but after a while, these things really build up in the psyche of the people who are hearing them day after day after day. And I have a quick, I think, yes, okay, we'll see if this works. I have a video here, it's just about 3 minutes long, on microaggressions, in case this is a new term for you, so we'll watch this really quickly. Let me make sure that the sound, I'm gonna stop this for just a second, make sure the sound is on it. Sometimes it doesn't work. There we go. Okay, you should get sound on this now.
In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law, banning discrimination against race, religion, sex, and national origin. While that was a step in the right direction, over 50 years later, America still has racial gaps in wealth, education, and criminal punishment. And an argument can be made for those more prominent racial issues, but what about comments like these?
You're doing chemistry so well because you're Asian.
Where are you from? Because your hair is different than like other hair.
Osama bin Laden was your uncle, right?
We're talking about microaggressions, which are usually unintended racial slights towards a person of a different race. The term microaggression was originally coined by psychiatrist Dr. Chester Pierce in the 1970s. It was later used by Columbia professor Darrell Sue to define the small interactions and understand the negative impacts they have. If you have never experienced a microaggression or considered yourself a perpetrator, then you're probably white, although everyone is capable of the act. But we're not just talking about race.
They can be based on race, but they're usually based on intersections of different social locations: race, class, gender, immigration status, phenotype.
It covers a broad scope of people, and once more, they usually occur unconsciously and automatically by the perpetrator. So they may not even realize that what they're saying can actually have an impact. And sometimes the perpetrator may think they're being innocent when they're actually being ignorant. So where do microaggressions come from?
Microaggressions, going back to the definition, are a part of a systemic racism, right? So they don't just happen, right? They aren't just kind of everyday racial slights or comments. There are processes and policies in place.
A 2015 case study on the impact of racial microaggressions explains the framework in 3 layers. The first are the microaggressions which occur verbally or non-verbally from people who are actually perpetrating, usually unconsciously, from institutional racism. Institutional racism involves the policies, such as the Jim Crow laws in the 1960s, the U.S. Patriot Act, and stop and frisk policing, that can marginalize people of different races, immigration status, and so on. What justifies these policies are ideologies such as white supremacy, which encompasses institutional racism and the racism people perpetuate every day without even realizing it. Basically, white supremacy is like an STD, and racial microaggressions is like the burning when you urinate. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. Unfortunately, antibiotics won't cure racism, but awareness can keep it from spreading before the damage is done.
Self-defeating effects, which can be denying that they happened, self-policing, so being very careful and kind of, self-surveillancing yourself to not confirm stereotypes.
It's important that we allow ourselves to learn how white supremacy contributes to racism. But America has work to do. According to a Pew Research survey, only 27% of whites in America agree it is more difficult to be black in the U.S. than to be white. If we're going to eradicate racism towards anybody just a little different, then we have to open ourselves up to learn how we contribute to the problem.
%27 of people think it's harder to be black than white.
Isn't that an incredible statistic?
I think that's that's the biggest problem right there, is that if we don't even acknowledge that it's a problem, how do you make it better? And I mean, a couple of examples. Jackson gets his license at the end of the month and is going to start driving on his own. And Katina and I were just talking about this. With all the terrifying thoughts that we have about that, one thing we don't have to worry about is him being pulled over by the police and thought to be a thug and, potentially harmed. There are a lot of things we don't have to worry about as white people. I have a friend who they really had to think about their child's name, kind of going back to the resume thing. It's ridiculous that they have to try to name their child a white-sounding name so that someday on a resume he'll get a callback, or she. And then I think of an example, Katina was in Illinois one time getting a rental car. It was an African-American guy there walking around looking at the license plates, trying to find one that was an Illinois license plate. That's something I've never thought about. He's more likely to be pulled over with an out-of-state tag. So he wanted an in-state tag, and that's something that we don't have to think about. There are hundreds of those types of examples, but 27% is ridiculous.
So I'll take back my comment about the lady clutching her purse. I suppose that is microaggression, isn't it? She probably learned that behavior from her parents, which would make it a racism issue.
That's probably, and one we haven't talked about today is it's what's called implicit bias. So implicit bias is your brain you're dealing with information constantly, so much input, and you can only process a certain amount. So your brain is hardwired to make decisions without you even thinking about them. And so we automatically put things in the category of dangerous and not, good and bad, and we make decisions without even thinking about them. based on our prior experience, the things we've been taught, the things that we see on TV, the things that we hear in church, the things we read about in school books. All of those things go into creating the brains that make these decisions for us without us thinking about it. So when she sees this young man walk down the street, I bet she doesn't think he's probably going to mug me, but the implicit bias that is feeding her brain tells her danger, and so she clutches her purse more so than she would if a white young man walked down the road. So that's one we'll get into implicit bias a little bit in future sessions, but I think that's one that plays into our racism when we don't mean to, without even thinking about it. In this video, so they talked about the term microaggressions are all of those things that people will say with not necessarily meaning to be racist. Sometimes they intend to give little jabs, sometimes not. Like, for instance, they said, where are you from? Where are you really from? If they say, I'm from Cleveland, where are you really from? Or they'll say things like, are you good at math because you're Asian? Or do you play basketball to a black boy? Things like that are microaggressions, things that we say because of their race or gender or whatever it is. And those are the little things that kind of pick at people. Can you think of others other than what they mentioned and what I mentioned?
Well, our son's wife, Leslie, is Filipino, and her brother was having dinner with us, and he said he got it all the time in school, where are you from? And he said, our dad always told us, we're Americans. We're not from anywhere. We're from here. We're Americans. And, and that was hard for other kids to accept because they look Filipino. They are Filipino. So their parents are Filipino.
They were born
here. They were all born here, and they're Americans, by golly.
One that happens in schools unintentionally, I'm sure, is that there are lower expectations for minorities than for white children. And so teachers may unintentionally say something like, they may say something along the lines of, you're really, really smart for a girl. Or they may say things like, well, who taught you that? Because they're surprised that the student knows something that perhaps someone of that race may not have already known. And so how would it feel as a student to have your teacher be surprised that you were smart?
Your teachers should think you're all smart and give you credit for what you can do. So.
Well, one of Paul's coworkers asked him one time how he could talk to me since I hadn't been to college.
Oh my.
Yeah.
So that's a microaggression, as people who are uneducated must not be smart, is the implicit bias there.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly.
Well, Marcia, you're a chemical engineer, so how did that go over?
Well,
she wasn't smart.
This was before I went to school. But I can tell you that once I got that degree, my esteem went up significantly with peers.
Well, you couldn't.
Interesting.
You couldn't do recording for the blind because you didn't have a BS.
Yeah, I volunteered for recording for the blind, and they didn't want me because I hadn't been to college.
Wow.
I learned to read in first grade, for crying out loud.
So as a female pastor, I get microaggressions about that from time to time. I'll get things like lady pastor, or that was pretty good for a woman. Things like that will happen periodically, where we don't refer to male pastors as male pastors. They're just pastors. But for some reason, female pastors are lady pastors. And we do this sometimes with minority. If we have a doctor who's black, you might say the black doctor, which you wouldn't say the white doctor, but you'll say the black doctor.
White doctors are a dime a dozen.
And so those kinds of things become microaggressions then. They become, the implicit bias there is that somehow, African American men are less likely to go to med school, and so there's something unique there. Or women are less likely to be pastors, and so there's something unique there. Whereas it is, the truth of it is, it's anyone has that opportunity in the United States. So the question then is, why do we care? These microaggressions, they're little things, things like lady pastor, black doctor, you didn't go to college, you must not be smart. Those kinds of things are passing comments. And so you would think, well, it's not that big of a deal. We're not restricting anyone's ability to go to med school. We're not restricting anyone's ability to go to seminary, to perform their job. Why do we care then? Why is that important? Why do we care about these microaggressions?
They're like the scab you were talking about. You keep picking at it and picking at it. And,
keeps the system going.
yeah.
It's ego.
Well, while it may not be important to us, it is very important to the people you're saying it to, because it keeps putting them down and putting them in their place. Or you don't
When it
notice.
adds up. It adds up over time.
I think that came out in the interviews that we saw, that they see this stuff all the time, and they're very sensitive to it.
Do you think that it plays into the ability for racism to be covert?
Sure.
Yeah.
If we normalize those kinds of statements, then society begins to accept them. It's no longer overt racism. It's all under the surface now.
Right.
And what about the individuals who experience the microaggressions? We talked about the scab. What does it do to them over time?
Some people probably handle it very well, it appears, while it simmers under the surface. But then, as you can see going on right now, there comes a point, probably for everyone, where that's going to rise up, and it's just going to be enough for someone. Other people may go on years and years, but I don't know how long I could take it. I mean, I could take someone saying, well, you didn't go to college, you probably don't understand. Once in a while, but constantly throughout your entire life, I just don't know how well I take that, really.
And ultimately, it's sort of going back to your scab reference. Just eventually, you have a scar that won't heal.
True.
And if we have to question ourselves every moment, it just takes so much away from our actual potential. If we have barriers and hurdles within us, it just makes acceptance more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of us never have to shoulder that burden. Not at that level.
In 1968, you may have heard of this woman, Jane Elliott. And if you don't know her name, you may know her story when you hear. She was a school teacher, and she was at home planning her lesson one day when she got the news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed. And she said that she made up her mind that day that she was going to teach her students how to love other people. And so she designed an experiment that was designed to help the students in her class, which were predominantly white, to feel what it felt like to experience some of these microaggressions and to be discriminated against based on something they had no control over. She came in the next day and told her students that blue-eyed students were favorable to brown-eyed students. She herself had blue eyes, and she said that she just preferred blue-eyed students. She felt like they were more highly evolved, they were probably smarter, and so she had all of the brown-eyed students put a collar on so they were easy to identify. And for the entire day, she treated the blue-eyed students as though they were her favorites and the brown-eyed students as though they were less than. She did not allow the brown-eyed students to play on the playground. They did not get a choice at lunch what they got. They were not allowed to use the water fountain. She made them use paper cups to get their drinks. For a whole day, she did this with them. And I would be surprised if you could get away with doing this now, because she talks about, I'm going to show you a quick video. I would encourage you to go back and watch. There's it's about an hour long, where there's actually footage of this experiment where she shows the experiment and she shows the parents' reactions as they're watching this happening. And little girls cry and little boys fight. They start to punch each other at one point. It's incredible how in just one day, the little girl's self-esteem started to drop. The boys' aggression started to grow in one day. This happened. So I'm going to show you a really quick video. This just is her decades later talking about this experiment. But I would encourage you on your own time to go back and find it. I can send it to you if you want it, so that you can see the whole thing. It is worth your time. It's a fascinating study, and it will make your heart hurt at how quickly this happens. Here we go. This is her now. Can you all hear that? I bet I forgot to turn the sound on. Sorry. It's 2 steps to share this video. I don't know why. There we go.
If I were black, they'd have killed me a long time ago. And if I were black and saying the things I say, I wouldn't be alive. Bullshit! No, you're not gonna say, I'm sorry, there's racism. No, I do not have to ask you nicely. I consider this exercise an injection of the live virus of racism. This exercise the next time you say I watched my students become what I told them they were. I watched little wonderful brown-eyed white people become vicious, ugly, nasty, discriminating, domineering people in the space of 15 minutes. I watched brilliant little blue-eyed white Christian children become timid and frightened and angry and unable to learn in the space of 15 minutes. If you do that with a whole group of people for a lifetime, you change them psychologically. You convince those who are analogous to the brown-eyed people that they are superior, that they are perfect, that they have the right to rule. Did you learn anything this morning?
I think I learned from the experience of feeling like I was in a class. I was powerless. I realized this morning that there were very few times in my life that I've ever been discriminated against, very few.
And you convince those who take the place of the blue-eyed students that they are less than.
How did they feel yesterday? Down like a dog on a leash.
If you do that for a lifetime, what do you suppose that does to them? You find out that there are people of color who refuse to live down to our expectations of them. I am now watching, at the national level, that exercise that I did based on eye color being reenacted in the government of the United States of America. I've done this with people of all ages for the last 50 years. Now think about that. Next year it will be the 50th anniversary of the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. The blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. What are you going to learn? When are we going to put a stop to this? White people's number one freedom in the United States of America is the freedom to be totally ignorant about those who are other than white. We live in the land of the free and the home of the brave. White people are the free, and people of color have to be brave. I want this situation to change. I want it to be such that no black person has to have courage to get up in the morning, any more than I, as a white person, have to have courage to get up in the morning. This is the most important book you or I or anybody else will ever read. I'm an educator. Every educator should refuse to perpetuate the myth of white superiority. There's only one race. It's the human race.
Have you all heard this experiment before? Have you heard her story at some point?
Yes.
They actually had that on NPR this morning, I think.
Oh, really?
I think so. It was either today or yesterday.
It was
Yeah,
today.
morning edition.
Oh, I missed it. I wish I'd seen. I'll go back and look. She's done a number of interviews. That one I found was just the shortest one I could show you in a quick amount of time. But she's been on a lot of different talk shows and news stations. And then there's a longer piece so you can watch the whole study. Just fascinating. So what did you hear? What's the result of what did she discover is the result of microaggressions? Or not? Those were not even really necessarily micro. Some of those were very overt.
And I've heard of this woman before in the study, and the thing that surprised me the most was how quickly the superior people, because she'll go into businesses, with like in a business meeting of like 100 people, trying to talk to them about racism, systematic racism, and how to not be a part of it, and she'll divide them into groups and do that. And how quickly people that know it's a game, people that know it's an exercise, how quickly they will become superior. I couldn't even imagine it with third grade children, but if someone tells you that you are superior to someone else, it does not take long at all for you to buy into that.
I think we're herd animals. We'll follow whoever tells us what we're supposed to do. I think about Germany. All the German people weren't bad, but who's going to speak up? If your government tells you this is the way it is, okay, that's the way it is. They didn't come for me, so I guess I'm okay.
Well, it is astounding how psychologically malleable we are.
And I think at least with that study that she did and continues, it talked about the effect it had on the bad ones. And she there was a comment about how that affected the ones who were supposedly superior and how quickly that took hold. And it just justifies all those actions. It sort of goes back to what Katina was saying, just that we have to recognize these things in ourselves. We have to be able to deal with these things within ourselves. And if we say that we're not, we're lying to ourselves, and that's the first thing we got to fix. But it's very powerful.
The interesting thing about if you watch the whole video is the next day she flips it. She comes in and she says, yesterday I lied to you. I told you that blue-eyed children were better, but actually brown-eyed children are better. And instantly everyone flipped. They took the collars off, and something about putting them on gave those kids the power, even though they knew what it felt like because they had been discriminated the day before against. That as soon as they put that collar on, they became bullies the very next day. And at the end of the experiment, she has them take the collars off, and she tells them, "I lied to both of you." And they talked through, which eye color is better, and the kids know they know that. And so she asked them, "What do you want to do with those collars?" And they say, "We want to throw them away." And there's one little boy that actually starts ripping them into pieces while he's standing there. So I think that is really powerful to look at. One day, just one day of discrimination was enough to make these kids feel very deeply wounded. And so much so that they wanted to, rip the collars up and end this experiment. So what does a lifetime of that do?
It seems like that type of an attack is emotional, which kind of bypasses your ability to realize, no, this is just a game and this is not real. But when it gets to an emotional level like that, it hits you a lot harder, and you just don't have the capacity to reason it out. So I think that's why it's so dangerous.
I remember when I was a kid, my little brother would get right up and say "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you." And he would get just as close as he could, and he was in my space, but he wasn't touching me. So there was nothing I could really tell on him about. He wasn't doing anything. And so I wonder if that's kind of the experience of experiencing this kind of ongoing microaggressions or even overt racism, that there's nothing you can report. You can't call the police and say these people are, that they're discriminating against me verbally. You can't really get much help with that. But eventually, I know when I was a kid, I would do that. He would do this until I would smack him, and then I'd be in trouble. And so I think some of that is what we're seeing. I think Deborah mentioned that it builds up and builds up until there's a breaking point. And I think some of that is what we're seeing, that the people who have experienced this for a lifetime have reached their breaking point and are responding.
It seems that if you compare the events of the last month in the Black Lives Matter protests and compare those to the things that were going on in the 60s, 68, and even before that, I mean, in the 50s, and these things happened. And it seems like every generation is maybe either becoming more emboldened to being able to speak, demanding their rights to speak, to protest. I don't know if that's progress or whether it's just kind of the old line. I'm trying to remember the name of the movie. Mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore. But it seems to be more and better organized. The fact that this spring it has been multiracial, which is a big plus. And I think just the momentum is building and building and building. And is that the expression of these 300, 400 years of essentially 400 years of slavery, basically? And I just remember in high school, I would hear people overhear people saying, well, we have to keep black people down because they're dangerous and they're vicious and they're, those things. And the thing that went through my mind was, if that were true, there wouldn't be a living white person on this continent if they were as terrible as that. And so these perceptions for the protesters, for black people, I just keep hoping for has the dam finally burst? Is there enough momentum not to go back? Because we have done that before. And it's scary, but it's hopeful all at the same time.
Yeah.
I hope, maybe it's only my hope, but
I think what's changed is that we're able to see what's happening to Black people now.
yeah,
If we didn't have the video of George Floyd being held on the ground for over 8 minutes,
yeah,
you know, it's kind of like, you know, think about the Vietnam War. The protests against the Vietnam War were incredible, and it was because it was the first war that we really saw on television. Every
That's right.
dark night, we were bombarded with these horrible images, and finally, the Black people are getting an opportunity to share those images with us. You know, cell phones have changed everything.
That's a good point.
it is.
We can't stick our heads in the sand anymore and say, oh, well, he's a criminal, so it's okay. That's an exaggeration, surely.
Police report.
Surely they didn't do that.
Police reports is just filed off somewhere and nobody ever sees it.
You know, think about the guy in Central Park. If he hadn't had his phone, he'd have been in big trouble.
Yeah.
They'd have believed her in a heartbeat.
And he's the one who's saying she's lost her job, she's lost her house, she's, you know, she really has taken a bit of a beating for her actions. But he's the one who's saying, no, I think she's had enough.
Yeah.
He's the one that's demonstrating grace and class and all those things that for so long, oh, Black people can't be like that. They can't be decent. And yet this guy's the decent one.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing to be white.
Amen.
Sometimes it is.
Amen.
Well, we certainly cannot make up for the sins of all of our white siblings who are, you know, overtly racist. But what we can do is to do a lot of self-examining. Ask yourself frequently, you know, be aware. Try to be aware when you see, when you notice yourself clutching your purse. Be aware. Why did I do that? You know, as you make decisions about who you invite to gatherings when we're allowed to have them again, and as you decide who is in your inner circle and how do you trust people, things like that. Doing lots and lots of self-inventory is hugely important because otherwise your brain's going to continue to make those decisions without consulting you first. So we have to make those less automatic and more intentional decision making. And that's the best that we can do. We can't control the actions of others. We can certainly do the best we can to control our own actions and to educate people around us when we see acts of racism happening. I do want to be respectful of your time, and we're at an hour mark. Is there anything anybody wanted to say before we wrap up today? I don't want you to burn with the thought you didn't get to share. Anything, last thoughts?
I don't just appreciate being able to join, and thank you very much.
We're so glad that you were here. Join us anytime. I hope you'll be a voice in our conversation regularly. I'm glad to see you all again.
And it's so refreshing I'm just so proud to be a Presbyterian. I mean, it's not just, not because of me, but because of the just remarkable people who are. And I think you're one of those. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's a great denomination, doing lots of great things in social justice. So, prayer concerns. I've got. If you hadn't heard, Bill Westmoreland was discharged from the hospital and moved to Diversicare for rehab yesterday. He is there now and settling in, and He can have phone calls and cards and so forth. I know he'd love to hear from you, but he's doing really well after his triple bypass surgery a few days ago. Kurt Alexander is in Vanderbilt. Today he had open heart surgery to replace a valve in his heart. And that's really all I know. I have not heard how that surgery went. Last time I talked to them, he was being prepared. He was doing prep for surgery. So I'll try to follow up with her this evening with Susan and see how Kurt is doing. And Bill Fugit is another one I'd ask for you to keep in your prayers. He is still at Beverly Park Place and will be for the duration of his life. And feeling very, very lonely right now with coronavirus. He has not been able to see his daughter. So he is feeling extremely lonely and isolated in this place where he doesn't know anyone yet. He needs your prayers and would also appreciate a call or a card or something periodically. You all have any others you'd like to add?
Katina, a friend of my daughter's has breast cancer, and they found that she also has pancreatic. So greatly in need of prayer.
What is her name?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
That's okay. God does.
Her husband is Dale, but I don't know her name. I'm sorry.
Any others? Okay, let's pray together. Holy One, we give you thanks for this space. We give you thanks for your incredible spirit which finds us in our homes. We give you thanks for the miracle of modern technology which keeps us connected even when we are apart. God, we ask that you would be with those we've lifted up by name and by situation tonight. We ask that you would draw near to them and give them healing and comfort and encouragement for the road ahead. And God, even as we ask this, we recognize you have no hands and no feet on this earth but our own. And so we ask that you would inspire the wisdom of the medical staff who are looking after them, make their hands steady and their minds clear. And God, we ask that you would help us to be the hands and feet of Christ, that we would bring comfort to those who are grieving and scared, and we would reach out to those who are feeling lonely and remind them of our presence and our love. God, as we leave this place tonight and go our separate ways, we ask that you would keep our eyes open for anywhere that there might be anything tainting your beautiful creation, that we would be aware of overt and covert racism, that we would be aware of microaggressions and implicit bias taking place in the world, and that you would help us to not only be aware of it, but to be more in control of it in our own lives and be advocates to speak up against it for others. God, we know that we could not do this if it was not by your grace, and so we ask that you would inspire us and walk with us on this journey. We lift all of this up in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you back next time.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Good to meet you all.
Bye, Steve.